The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Eli Calhoun found the woman half buried in a drift on the eastern slope of the Wind River Range, and for one long, terrible moment, he believed she was already dead. He had been tracking a wounded elk through the pale gray curtain of the storm, following the dark drops of blood that peppered the snow like scattered seeds when the shape appeared, small and dark and utterly wrong against the white expanse of the Wyoming wilderness. It was the winter of 1874, deep in the heart of the American West, and the temperature had dropped so low that the pines around him crackled and popped like rifle shots in the frozen air. Eli had lived alone in these mountains for 6 years, longer than some men lived in civilization, and in all that time, he had never once found another human being this far from any trail. He dropped to his knee beside her, pulling off his heavy elk-hide glove with his teeth, and pressed 2 thick, calloused fingers against her throat. The pulse was there, faint as a candle guttering in a draft, barely a whisper of life, but it was there. He exhaled a breath he did not realize he had been holding, a great cloud of vapor swirling around his bearded face. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, with dark hair plastered against cheeks that had gone the waxy, terrible color of old tallow. She wore a dark wool dress, plain and severe, with a white apron frozen stiff over it, and a prayer cap, a white bonnet, that was so caked with ice and snow it had become almost unrecognizable. The clothing was unmistakable to a man who had traded in enough frontier settlements to know the dress of the plain folk. She was Amish, impossibly, inexplicably, here in the deepest wilderness of Wyoming territory. And she was pregnant. The swell of her belly, enormous and unmistakable even beneath the frozen layers of wool and ice, told him she was very close to her time. Eli Calhoun was not a man given to panic. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe, and arms that could drag a full-grown elk carcass through a mile of deep snow without stopping. His dark chestnut hair fell past his jaw, shot through now with threads of early frost, and his beard was thick and full, the kind that came from years of outdoor living rather than fashion. He had been alone so long that he sometimes forgot the sound of his own voice, and the wild had shaped him into something as sturdy and enduring as the mountains themselves. But looking down at this young woman, this impossibly out of place, desperately fragile, very pregnant young woman, he felt something shift in his chest like a log settling in a fire. He could not leave her. He would not. He gathered her up into his arms as gently as he knew how, and she weighed almost nothing against his chest despite the child she carried, because cold does that to a person, strips away everything until there is almost nothing left. Her head lolled against the front of his heavy coat, and he adjusted his hold so that she was cradled against the warmth of his body, one arm beneath her knees and one across her back, her head tucked under his chin. Then he turned away from the elk tracks and started the long walk back to his cabin. The storm screamed at him from every direction. The wind came down off the peaks in great howling gusts that tried to knock him sideways, and the snow fell so thick and fast that he navigated more by instinct and memory than by sight. He had walked this stretch of mountain 1,000 times in every kind of weather, and his feet found the trail even when his eyes could not. He walked for an hour, maybe more, with the woman pressed against his chest, and he talked to her the entire way, not because he expected an answer, but because he understood on some deep, wordless level that the sound of a human voice could sometimes keep a person tethered to the living world when nothing else could. "Stay with me," he said, again and again, his voice low and steady over the roar of the wind. "Just stay with me. We are almost there. Stay with me." The cabin materialized out of the storm like a dream, low and solid, built from lodgepole pine with a stone chimney chinked tight against the cold, half buried in snow up to the window ledge, but radiating a faint welcoming warmth from the coals he had banked that morning. Eli kicked open the door, ducked inside, and pushed it shut behind him with his heel. The warmth hit him like a wall. He had left the fire running, a good deep bed of coals in the stone hearth, and the small space held the heat the way a cupped hand holds water. He carried the woman to the narrow rope bed against the far wall and laid her down as carefully as if she were made of something that might shatter, then immediately turned to the hearth and began feeding wood to the coals with urgent, practiced hands. The fire caught and climbed quickly. Eli swung the iron hook in the kettle, always filled, always ready, a mountain man's discipline, moved over the growing flame. Then he came back to the woman and began the careful, deliberate work of undoing what the cold had done. Her outer clothes were frozen stiff and had to be cut away in places with his knife. He worked methodically, keeping his focus on the task and his expression steady, removing only what needed to be removed and replacing each layer with warm, dry wool from his own supply as he went. He had wool blankets enough. He had traded well last autumn at the settlement in South Pass City, and he wrapped her in them one by one, careful of the great swollen curve of her belly, careful of her hands, which were the worst. Her fingers had gone white and hard, and he recognized frostbite when he saw it. He filled the wash basin with water from the kettle, cool enough not to burn but warm enough to matter, and held her hands submerged in it for a long time, chafing them gently between his palms, watching the color begin its agonizing, creeping return. She made a sound once while he was working on her hands, just a small, weak sound, like something heard through water, but it sent relief flooding through him so powerfully that he had to pause and press his forehead briefly against his fist. "There you are," he said quietly. "There you are." He made broth from the venison hanging in his cold store, a simple thing, just meat and melted snow and a handful of dried herbs he kept in a tin, and he fed it to her a spoonful at a time when she began to come around, her eyes fluttering open to reveal dark brown irises, confused and glassy with cold and exhaustion. She could not hold the spoon herself yet, so he held it, and she swallowed weakly, and he kept at it with the steady patience of a man who knew that some things simply could not be rushed. "You are safe," he told her each time her eyes cleared enough to hold a spark of awareness. "You are warm, and you are safe. You do not need to do anything right now. Just rest." It was deep night before she was truly conscious, and when she finally opened her eyes and kept them open and looked at him with something approaching real comprehension, the fire had burned down to a comfortable, steady glow, and the storm outside had not lessened 1 degree. She stared at him for a long moment. He was sitting in his single chair pulled up close to the bed, elbows on his knees, and he knew he must look alarming. A huge, bearded, long-haired man in a rough cabin in the middle of nowhere, and so he stayed very still and kept his expression as open and unthreatening as he knew how to make it, which took some effort given that his natural resting expression had been described by more than one frontier trader as resembling a winter thunderstorm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. She swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was so hoarse and fragile it was barely audible. "Where am I?" "My cabin, in the Wind River Range, Wyoming territory." He paused. "You were in the snow. You would have died in another hour, maybe less." She closed her eyes. He watched her lips move and understood after a moment that she was praying. "My name is Eli Calhoun," he said when she was done. "I've lived in these mountains for 6 years. I'm a trapper and hunter. I live alone." He felt the inadequacy of this description. It did not tell her anything she really needed to know, which was whether she was truly safe, which she was, but it was what he had. She opened her eyes again. "Ruth," she said. "My name is Ruth Byler." "Ruth," he nodded. "Are you in pain, Ruth? Is the child—" "The child is moving," she said, and something almost like a smile touched her cracked lips. "He has been moving since I woke. I think he's frightened." "He?" Eli said. "I do not know. It is what I say to him." Her hand moved under the blankets, and he understood she had found her own belly. "He is a comfort." Eli leaned back in his chair and gave her space. The fire popped. The storm howled against the single window, which was shuttered tight. He waited. "I need to ask you something," she said at last. "Ask." "How far are we from the nearest settlement?" He told her the truth, because she deserved the truth. "South Pass City is 3 days' ride in good weather. We are snowed in here for at least a week, maybe 2. The passes are closed." He watched her absorb this. "There is no danger to you here," he added. "I have food enough and wood enough and everything you need. But I will not pretend you are going anywhere soon." Ruth was quiet for a long time. The firelight moved across her face, illuminating the exhaustion, and something else beneath it, a deep, settled kind of sorrow that was different from fear or despair. It was the sorrow of someone who has already made a great and terrible journey before the physical one even began. "My husband," she said at last. "He died. In September. A sickness came through our settlement in Ohio, and he was gone in 2 weeks." She said it with a plainness that was not coldness, but rather a kind of unadorned honesty, as if she had stripped the sentence down to its essential truth because she could not afford to clothe it in feeling right now. "I was 4 months along. His family, they were kind, but I could not stay. And my own family is in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I thought—" She stopped. "I was traveling with a group heading east along the trail. We were separated. I was confused. And then the storm came." Eli listened to all of this without interrupting, which was his way. When she was finished, he said, "You do not have to explain anything to me. You owe me nothing. What happened, happened. What matters now is that you are here and alive and warm." Ruth looked at him. Really looked at him the way a person looks when they are trying to take the measure of something unfamiliar. He let her look. "You are a very direct man," she said. "I've spent a long time with no one to talk to," he said. "I find I have lost the habit of being anything else." The smallest thing crossed her face that might, in better circumstances, have become a laugh. She slept again after that, deeply and without moving, and Eli sat beside her through the night, feeding the fire and listening to the storm batter at the walls of his cabin, and felt something shifting in him that he could not quite name, something that had been still and dormant for a very long time, like a creek locked under winter ice, beginning in some imperceptible way to move. The next morning brought no break in the storm, but brought Ruth considerably more strength. She sat up on her own and accepted the tin cup of strong, dark coffee he offered with both hands wrapped around it, drawing the warmth in with an expression of quiet gratitude that was more eloquent than most speeches. The morning light that came in around the edges of the shuttered window was thin and gray and flat, the particular quality of light that exists only inside a blizzard, and it gave the cabin a strange, enclosed, separate feeling, as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist, and there was only this: the fire, the warmth, the two of them, and the snow. "I would like to help," Ruth said, "if there are tasks I can do. I am not accustomed to idleness." Eli looked at her. She was still pale, still clearly weak, still very visibly pregnant, and she had hypothermia not 24 hours past. But there was something in her expression, a certain determined uprightness, that told him arguing would be a waste of breath. "You can sort the dried herbs," he said. "They are in that tin on the shelf. I've been meaning to get around to it." Ruth got around to it immediately. She settled herself carefully at the edge of the bed, reached for the tin he indicated, and began working through it with knowing hands. She recognized rosemary and sage and yarrow, and was curious about several others, which led to the first real conversation between them, one that moved with the natural ease of two people discovering, with some surprise, that they have more in common than expected. She knew plants. She had learned from her mother and grandmother and the generations of women before them, the accumulated practical knowledge of a community that relied on itself for almost everything. Eli had learned from necessity and from an old Shoshone trapper named Washakie, who had befriended him in his first brutal winter on the mountain and taught him more about surviving in wild country than any book could have done. They compared knowledge, and it turned out they knew many of the same remedies from different traditions, and this delighted Ruth in a way that broke through her sorrow like sunlight through clouds, briefly, warmly, genuinely. "Yarrow for bleeding," she said. "Yarrow for bleeding," he agreed. "And fever." "And fever," she confirmed. "My grandmother swore by it." "Washakie's people used it the same way," Eli said. He was at the hearth feeding the fire. He glanced back at her. "They knew this land better than any person who ever came after them," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not just acknowledgement, but genuine reverence. "What has been done to them? The treaties broken, the land taken, none of it is right. I have seen it up close and it sits heavy with me." Ruth looked at him, surprised perhaps that he would say such a thing so plainly. "It is an injustice," she said quietly. My community does not involve itself in the politics of the world, but we know what injustice is. We have known it ourselves. I know, Eli said. I know you have. The day moved slowly and pleasantly in the way that days inside a warm place can when the world outside is impassable. Eli showed her the cabin. There was not much to show. The single main room with the hearth and the table and the chair and the bed, the small cold store built into the north wall where the temperature stayed reliably below freezing, the shelves of dried goods and tools and supplies that represented 6 years of careful, methodical accumulation. Ruth moved slowly through the space with her hand sometimes pressed to the small of her back, taking everything in with dark, observant eyes. "You have made it very comfortable," she said, and she meant it without condescension or surprise. She ran one finger along the shelf where he kept his books, 3 of them battered and worn but cared for, and read the spines. A Bible, a volume of Emerson's essays, a battered, water-stained copy of A Natural History of North American Mammals. "You read," she said. "In the evenings," he said. "There's not much else to do once the work is done. The winters are long." "We read," she said. "Only the Bible and approved texts. But yes." She pulled out the Emerson and turned it over in her hands. "Though I have heard of this man." "He writes about the natural world," Eli said, "about solitude and self-reliance. It seemed appropriate." Ruth opened it to a random page and read silently for a moment, her lips very slightly moving. Then she put it back with a small nod, as though confirming some interior assessment. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She considered this with the same plain honesty she brought to everything. "I did not expect a man who would carry a stranger through a blizzard and sit up all night keeping her warm and have Emerson on his shelf," she said, "but I'm glad of it." Eli looked away, into the fire. The tips of his ears had gone, he suspected, somewhat red, which was an absurd thing for a man of his size and solitude to experience. He was very glad his beard covered most of his face. On the 3rd day of the storm, Ruth began to feel the first stirrings of early labor. She did not say so immediately. She noticed the change in pressure, the tightening that was different from the ordinary discomforts of late pregnancy. And she sat with this knowledge for a while, taking stock of it as a practical matter. She was, by her own calculation, within 2 weeks of her time. She had been half frozen and physically exhausted. She was snowed into a mountain cabin with no midwife, no doctor, no female company, and no prospect of reaching civilization for at least a week. The circumstances were, she acknowledged to herself, with a frankness that was perhaps her finest quality, quite dire. Eli was outside splitting wood. She could hear the clean, rhythmic crack of the axe through the log walls, steady and certain, like a heartbeat, when the first real contraction came. It doubled her over where she sat at the table, and she gripped the edge of the wood with both hands and breathed through it the way her mother had taught her, long and slow and deliberate, counting in her head. When Eli came back in with his arms full of split pine, he read the situation in half a second. He dropped the wood by the hearth with a crash and was across the room in 3 strides. "How long?" he said. She looked up at him. "You know about this?" "I have helped animals through it," he said. "I know the principles." She almost laughed despite everything. "I'm not a horse." "No," he said. "You are considerably harder to calm down, in my experience." He crouched beside her chair, bringing his face level with hers, and looked at her steadily. "You tell me what you need and I will do it. Everything I have is at your disposal, but I need to know how long." "The pain started perhaps an hour ago," she said. "They are not yet close together. There is time." Eli stood, and she watched him take command of the situation with a directness and efficiency that should perhaps have surprised her, but somehow did not. He built the fire high. He put every pot and kettle he owned over the flame and filled them with clean snow. He stripped the bed and remade it with what clean linens he had, supplemented by a canvas tarp he oiled and lined with fresh wool. He brought in more wood than they could possibly burn and stacked it against the wall. He was methodical and quiet and utterly unfrightened, and Ruth, who'd been fighting down a very reasonable terror for the past hour, found that his steadiness was contagious in the most welcome possible way. "Have you delivered an animal alone before?" she asked between contractions while he was preparing. Twice, he said. A mare, once, and a wolf that had been injured and came to my door in winter. I do not recommend either experience as preparation for this, but it is what I have. Tell me about the wolf, she said. He looked at her, surprised. Now? It will take my mind off things, she said. So he told her about the wolf, a gray female, who had apparently decided that the smell of smoke and cooked meat emanating from his cabin represented safety, and who had appeared on his doorstep one November night with a broken rear leg and an expression that Eli described as combining extreme distress with extreme dignity in equal measure. He had set the leg and kept the wolf for 3 weeks while it healed, and she had repaid his hospitality by bringing down a deer and leaving it at his door the first day she was strong enough to hunt again, before disappearing back into the wilderness. That, Ruth said, through the grip of a contraction that was stronger than the last, is the finest story I have ever heard. I have more, he said. Breathe slowly. That is right. Keep breathing. I will tell you another one. The labor was long. It moved through the afternoon and into the evening with the particular merciless rhythm that has been the same since the beginning of human existence, progress measured in pain and breath and the expanding space between moments. Eli was everything he needed to be, which was steady and present and warm and absolutely calm on the outside, even when, he would have admitted this to no one, his heart was hammering with a fear far more intense than anything a wolf or a grizzly had ever produced in him. He talked to her almost continuously, telling her stories of the mountains, of the elk and the bear and the Shoshone people, of the winter he had been caught in a rock slide and dug himself out with his bare hands, of the spring morning when he had stood at the summit of a peak he had never named and looked out over 100 miles of wilderness and felt something so immense and wordless that he had stood there for 2 hours, just breathing. Ruth listened when she could and endured when she could not, and gripped his hand with a strength that astonished him and left bruises on his fingers that he would carry for a week. The boy was born just before midnight, in the light of the fire, howling with a fury that suggested he had opinions about the circumstances of his arrival and was not keeping them to himself. He was small but strong and perfectly formed, and he announced his presence to the world with a voice that seemed entirely too large for his size, and Eli, who had handled weapons and wild animals in frontier emergencies without flinching, felt his throat close with something raw and unmanageable as he wrapped the child in the warmest, softest cloth he owned. He placed the baby in Ruth's arms. She held him and looked at him for a long, silent moment, and then she pressed her face against the top of his head and wept with a completeness and a freedom that told Eli she had not let herself do it before, not in all the months since her husband died, not during the long and desperate journey, not during the cold and the snow. She wept now because she was warm and safe and alive, and her son was alive, and because grief and gratitude exist side by side in the human heart in a way that makes perfect sense even when no words can explain it. Eli sat on the floor beside the bed with his back against the logs and his arms on his knees, and let her cry without trying to stop it or fix it or fill the silence, because there are moments that belong entirely to the person living them, and this was one of them. After a long while, Ruth looked up. Her eyes were red and wet, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His name is Jacob, she said, after his father. Jacob, Eli repeated. It is a good name. She looked at him then with those dark, serious eyes, and she said, Thank you, Eli. I do not have the words for what you have done. You do not need them, he said. Rest now. I will watch him. She handed the baby to him with a trust that made something break open in the center of his chest, and he held the child against his broad chest, this small, warm, entirely helpless creature, and sat by the fire through the long hours of the night while the blizzard slowly, finally, began to tire of itself and lose its fury, and the howling outside softened and fell, by degrees, toward silence. In the days that followed, the cabin became something Eli had no category for. He had lived alone for so long that he had stopped thinking of the space as anything other than functional, a place to sleep and eat and store things, as neutral and purposeless as a rock outcropping. But Ruth filled it with the habits and rhythms of living that he had forgotten were possible. She hummed while she worked, hymns mostly, low and gentle, and the sound of it moved through the cabin like warmth. She organized things, not his things, not intrusively, just the general domestic landscape, with a quiet efficiency that made the space feel entirely different, cared for in a way that was not the same as clean but was related to it. Jacob slept in a drawer Eli padded with wool and suspended from a ceiling beam to keep it off the cold floor, a solution Ruth had pronounced inspired, and he woke at intervals through the day and night with the predictable and demanding schedule of a newborn. And the cabin that had for 6 years held only the sounds of one solitary man now held the sounds of 2 people talking, and a baby, and the fire. And it was, Eli thought in his more unguarded moments, an entirely different kind of fullness than he had known before. He gave Ruth his bed and made his own on a bedroll by the fire, close enough to keep warm and to hear if either she or the baby needed anything in the night. He thought she might protest this arrangement. The propriety of it by her community standards was already far outside any boundary she would have observed in Ohio. But Ruth was a practical woman, and she understood that they were in the wilderness and that the rules that govern daily life in a settlement are not the same rules that govern survival in a mountain cabin in winter, and she accepted the arrangement with simple gratitude. The days were building toward something, though neither of them acknowledged it directly yet. It lived in the way their hands would sometimes occupy the same small space, passing the coffee cup, reaching for the same piece of wood, and the way she would look up when he came in from outside, and the particular quality of attention they gave each other in conversation, as though what the other person said mattered in a way that went beyond mere information exchange. It lived in the way Eli had started talking more than he had talked in years, drawn out by her questions and her listening. She was a remarkable listener, Ruth Byler, the kind who made you feel that what you were saying was worth saying, and in the way, she sometimes fell quiet in the middle of a sentence because she was watching his hands, the way they moved, big and careful and certain. On the 6th day after Jacob's birth, the weather cleared. It came suddenly, the way Wyoming winter storms sometimes end. Between 1 hour and the next, the clouds parted and the sky turned a blue so sharp and absolute it seemed impossible, the kind of blue that exists only after great storms have scoured the air clean. Eli went outside at first light and stood in the snow that came to his thighs and breathed the cold, crystal air and felt the familiar pull of the mountains after a storm, the silence so profound it had texture, the world so clean and white and remade it seemed almost new. But the feeling that followed the relief was complicated. Ruth could leave now. Or rather, she could leave in a few days once she was stronger. He could take her to South Pass City on the horse, break a trail if he had to. She could get there, find a way east, find her family. She could go home. That was the right thing. That was the only thing. A young Amish widow with a newborn baby had no business living in a mountain trapper's cabin. And he knew this. And he told himself that he knew it every time he looked at her and felt that unfamiliar and inconvenient warmth in the center of his chest. He told her at breakfast that the storm had broken. Ruth looked out through the window. He had unshuttered it, and the morning light came in blue-white and brilliant, and nodded slowly. She had Jacob at her shoulder, patting his back in that small, automatic, constant rhythm that new mothers develop. She did not say anything immediately. "You can reach South Pass City in 2 days," Eli said. "Maybe less if we make good time. I will take you as far as you need to go." "I know," she said. A silence. The fire crackled. "Is that what you want?" he asked, and then immediately felt that the question was inappropriate and intrusive, and said, "I only mean, I want to be sure you are well enough. Jacob is only 6 days old." "I am well enough," she said, but she was still looking out the window, not at him. "Eli," she paused, turned to him. "What is in South Pass City?" He frowned slightly. "A post office, a general store, 2 saloons, a hotel, some good people and some not very good people, like every town." "No," she shook her head. "I mean, what is there for me? I have no money. I have no possessions but what I am wearing. I have a 6-day-old child. My family's in Pennsylvania, which is—" She gestured with her free hand, a gesture that took in the endless miles between Wyoming territory and the Atlantic coast. There are people in South Pass City who would help, he said carefully. There are people in South Pass City who would help a young Amish widow with a newborn find the next available wagon east, she said. Yes, I know. That is the practical answer. She shifted Jacob to her other shoulder and looked at Eli with those direct brown eyes. Can I ask you something, and will you answer me honestly? Always, he said. Because he would. He was that kind of man. Do you want me to leave? The question sat in the air between them like a living thing. Eli looked at it for a moment, at her, really, at the way the morning light made a gold edge along the dark hair that had come loose from her prayer cap, at the way she held her baby with that combination of exhaustion and certainty, at the open and completely undefended look on her face. And he thought about the last 6 years of silence and the last 10 days of something else entirely. And he said the truth. No, he said. I do not. Ruth nodded, slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already understood. I did not think so, she said. But what you want is what matters, he said, because it was, and because he needed her to know that. I want to be honest with you, she said, the same way you are honest with me, so I will tell you that I came out here to die. She said it quietly, without drama, the way she said everything, plainly and without ornament. Not by intention, but I was so tired and so alone and so afraid. And when I was separated from the group and the storm came, I think some part of me simply stopped fighting. She looked down at Jacob. And then you found me. And now I am here, and my son is alive, and I have not felt afraid since the night I woke up in this cabin. She looked up again. That is something I want to understand better. Eli was quiet for a long time. What is your community's view, he said at last very carefully, on someone who... He stopped. Ruth understood what he was asking. On a woman who does not go home to her community? She considered. I am a widow. I have already lost much of what would hold me there. My husband's family would welcome me back, but they would expect me to live by the community's rules entirely, and to one day marry someone they approved of. My own family. My mother is gone. My father remarried. I am welcome, but I am not needed in the way I would want to be needed. She paused. I have thought about this a great deal in the past months, long before the storm. There are those among my people who would say I was shunned the moment I chose not to return. But I have not been baptized into the church. I made that choice before my husband died, because I had questions I could not answer. And so technically, in the most practical terms, I am not bound. That cannot have been an easy realization, he said. No, she said. It was not. She adjusted Jacob in her arms. I still believe in God, she said. Very much. I believe in everything real, the beauty of the world and the responsibility to care for people and to work and to be honest and to be kind. I do not know if that makes me Amish still or something else. She looked at him. What do you believe in? He thought about this seriously, because she deserved a serious answer. The mountains, he said. The way the world looks at first light before a man has done anything to it yet. The idea that a person owes their neighbors, whoever their neighbors happen to be, decency and honesty and help when it's needed. The same things you said, really, without the specific theology. He paused. I was raised Methodist. I have not been inside a church in 10 years, but I do not think God requires a particular building. Ruth smiled. It was a real smile this time, full and warm, not the small careful ones she had been offering so far, and it changed her face completely, opened it up, and Eli felt that shift in his chest again, more pronounced now, harder to ignore. I do not either, she said. They stayed. Neither of them said it aloud exactly in those terms, but the decision was made in the way that the most significant decisions sometimes are, not with an announcement or a formal declaration, but with a series of smaller choices that accumulate, day by day, into a life. Eli did not push for anything. He understood, not because anyone told him, but because he was paying attention, that Ruth was in a place of great complexity. She had lost a husband. She had survived something that should have killed her. She was newly postpartum in a remote mountain cabin with a stranger who was not a stranger anymore. He understood that what was growing between them was real, but that it needed time, the same way a seedling needs time. Not intervention, not acceleration, just consistent warmth and the willingness to wait. So he waited. And he gave her everything he could give without giving what was not yet his to give. He taught her how to read the weather in the mountains by the particular quality of the light and the behavior of the wildlife. She taught him a bread recipe her grandmother had passed down, adapted for the camp oven he had, and the cabin filled with a smell that made him feel a kind of homesickness for somewhere he had never actually been. He showed her the elk trails on the south slope that caught the afternoon sun and collected the first green growth in spring. She showed him a more efficient way to hang herbs to dry that took up less room in his limited space and preserved the volatile oils better. Jacob grew with the rapid, confident pace of healthy infants, discovering his hands in the ceiling and his mother's face and the interesting texture of Eli's beard with equal systematic enthusiasm. Eli, who had never spent any time around infants and had not expected to have any particular feeling about them, found that Jacob's interest in him was both extremely flattering and strangely moving. The baby watched him with an unwavering concentration that seemed to contain genuine assessment, and Eli took this seriously and talked to him as he would talk to anyone, explaining what he was doing and why, showing him things, telling him the names of plants and weather patterns and the shapes of the mountains visible through the window. Ruth watched this and did not say anything about it, but her eyes, when she looked at them together, held something that she had not been putting words to. It was 3 weeks after the blizzard ended that they first truly crossed the distance between them, not in any dramatic way. Eli had come in from a half-day's work on the south-facing slope where he had found a family of elk settling in for the rest of winter, and he was cold and tired and moving with the particular heaviness of a man who's been working hard in cold air, and Ruth was at the fire, and she just stood up and handed him the coffee before he even asked, and when their hands overlapped on the tin cup, she did not move hers away, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and there it was. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. I think about you," she said with her usual absolute directness that he had come to understand was her version of courage, stripping away circumlocution to show the thing plainly. "I think about you quite a lot, and I do not think it is only gratitude, because I know what gratitude feels like, and this is different. I wanted you to know, because you deserve to know it, and because I do not think I should keep it from you." Eli set the coffee cup down very carefully on the table. He turned to her fully. She was standing in the firelight, very still, holding her ground with that uprightness that was the most essentially Ruth thing about her, waiting for him to respond. "Ruth," he said, and stopped. He was not, as he had noted to her himself, a man who had spoken at length to other people in some years, and the things that were in him right now did not come in words easily. He tried anyway, because she had been honest with him, and he owed her the same. "The day I found you in the snow," he said, "something changed in me. I do not know how to describe it better than that. Something that had been still for a very long time started to move." He looked at his own hands, then back at her. "I have been trying not to press you, because I understand that you are carrying a great deal, and I did not want to be one more thing you had to deal with. But if you are asking whether I feel, if you are asking whether what you said goes in both directions—" "Does it?" she said. "Yes," he said. "It does." The space between them closed, as spaces do when the time is finally right for them to close, naturally, without force, like two rivers meeting. He touched her face with one big, careful hand, and she leaned into it, and he bent down and kissed her with the same deliberate gentleness he brought to everything delicate, and she reached up and put her hands against his chest where she could feel the solid warmth of him, and the kiss was not hurried or greedy, but full and serious and complete in the way that the most honest things are. Jacob, from his padded drawer, made a small sound of commentary. They broke apart, and Ruth laughed, a real full laugh, the first completely unguarded one Eli had heard from her, and he laughed too, which was something he had not done in so long it felt strange in his chest, like a muscle being used for the first time. "I think he has opinions," Eli said. "He has had opinions since before he was born," Ruth said. "I believe he gets it from his mother." The weeks that followed were the best Eli could remember in a long time, possibly ever, though he did not have a great deal to compare to, because he had spent the formative years of his adulthood alone, and happiness, when you have lived without it for a long time, does not always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it is only visible in retrospect, when you look back from a later point and understand what that time contained. But he had it now, clearly, unmistakably, in the mornings when he woke and heard Ruth and Jacob already stirring and knew that the fire would be lit and the coffee would be made and there would be someone to talk to. In the evenings when the work was done and they sat together by the fire, sometimes reading aloud to each other from his battered books, sometimes talking and sometimes quiet, in the particular comfortable way of people who have passed the stage where silence feels like something that needs to be filled. He began to build. It started with small things, an actual cradle for Jacob, proper and rocking, which he constructed from pine with the same care he gave his traps, each joint fitted cleanly and the whole thing sanded smooth. Ruth ran her hand along it when he brought it inside and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You are a craftsman, Eli Calhoun," with a warmth that was entirely specific to him, the way praise means more when it comes from someone who knows what they are talking about, and it landed on him like sunlight. Then he began the addition to the cabin. He had been thinking about it, planning it, drawing it roughly in the ash at the edge of the hearth with a stick in the early mornings before Ruth woke, since about the second week after Jacob was born, though he had not said anything about it yet because he was not ready to put words to what the planning meant. But the time came when putting words to it was the right thing to do. And so one evening he laid out the plan with the straightforwardness that had become the register of their relationship. "I want to build another room," he said, "and a root cellar underneath for proper storage. And I've been thinking that the south face there," he gestured toward the window, "gets enough light that we could put in a kitchen garden come spring. I know how to build a windbreak that would extend the growing season." Ruth looked at him across the fire with an expression he was still learning to read fully but was getting better at. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. "I'm asking you what you want," he said. "But yes, in addition to that, yes." "What would we be?" she asked. This was not a challenge or a rebuke. It was a practical question, asked honestly, because she was always honest. "I mean, what would people in South Pass City think, and what would we call it to Jacob when he is old enough to ask?" "I would call you my wife," Eli said, "if you were willing. And if you were not ready for that, I would call you my household, my family, which is what you are. And I would not ask you to be anything sooner than you were willing." She was quiet for long enough that he had time to feel the particular precariousness of having said a true thing out loud and having to wait for the world to respond to it. "Jacob needs a father," she said at last, "a real one. Not a paid-for piece of paper, but an actual man who will be there when he has questions about the world and needs someone to show him how to do things and will read to him and argue with him and hold him to account." She paused. "I told myself I would not do anything foolish or too fast, but then I also told myself a great many things that turned out to be completely overridden by what actually happened." She looked at him. "Ask me properly," she said. He got up from his chair and he went to her, and he took both her hands, and he got down on one knee in the firelight of the small log cabin in the Wind River Range, with the winter mountains behind every wall and the baby asleep in his cradle, and he asked her properly. She said yes. They made their way to South Pass City in early April, when the passes were clear enough to travel, Eli on the horse and Ruth riding behind him with Jacob bundled against her chest in a carrier he had fashioned from canvas strapping. The town materialized slowly out of the plain, a scatter of buildings that ranged from proper timber construction to barely glorified tents, with a main street of cold brown mud and a general store that also housed the post office, and a sign that advertised doctor services on Tuesdays and Thursdays. South Pass City in 1875 was a town that had seen better days. The gold rush that had built it was mostly past, and it wore the faded, determined air of a place that was trying to become something more permanent than its origins. But it had people in it who had made a decision to stay and build something real, And those people had a welcome in them for newcomers that was different from the careless friendliness of boom times. It was a considered, practical welcome, the welcome of people who needed each other. A woman named Mrs. Agatha Brennan, who ran the hotel and general store jointly and seemed to know everything that happened within 50 miles, was the first person who mattered that they encountered. She was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair and the calloused hands of someone who had worked every day of her life and was not finished yet. And she took one look at Ruth, at the prayer cap which Ruth still wore, at Jacob against her chest, at the careful plainness of her dress, and then one look at Eli, who filled the doorway behind her and said, "Well, come in then. I have coffee on, and you look like you have a story." They told it to her over coffee, the essential version, the one that was true without being all of it. And Agatha listened with her hands around her own cup and an expression that was entirely without judgment. "You need a minister," she said when they were done. "Reverend Atkinson comes through on the first Friday of the month. That is 9 days from now." She looked at Ruth. "Do you want to stay until then? Or can you manage without the formality?" "I would like the formality," Ruth said. "I believe in doing things properly." Agatha looked at Eli. "And you?" "Whatever she wants," he said. Agatha nodded, as though this confirmed her assessment. "You can have the upstairs room for the 9 days. I will charge you working rate. That means you work for it. I have a list of things that need doing." Eli looked at the list she produced and agreed to it without complaint. It included fixing the wagon wheel on her delivery cart, replacing 4 boards on the back porch that had rotted through the winter, and cleaning out the chimney of the second guest room. He did all of it in the first 5 days, which seemed to genuinely surprise Agatha, who had allocated 9. "What do you do with the extra time?" she asked him, on the evening he finished the last task. "I'm building a cradle for Mrs. Turner's new baby," he said. "She mentioned hers had broken. I had wood left over." Agatha looked at him for a moment, then said, "You know, I've been trying to find someone to take on the old Hargrove cabin up on Miller's Creek for 3 years. It is about 8 miles from town, and it needs considerable work, but the land with it is good, and the creek does not run dry." Eli looked at her carefully. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Agatha said, "that there are more ways to live in a mountain than the way you have been living, and that a man with skills and a family might find it worth considering." He thought about this. He thought about it that night while Ruth slept and Jacob slept, and he lay awake in the narrow hotel bed, the first proper mattress he had been on in 6 years, staring at the ceiling. He thought about what Ruth wanted, and he did not assume he knew, because she was a person who had her own clear sense of what she needed, and he was still learning to read it accurately. But he thought about Jacob growing up with the mountains in every direction and the town 8 miles away on a good road, with neighbors and a school and a community forming around him. He thought about the difference between the solitude he had chosen for himself when he was alone and the solitude that would mean something different when it was chosen for a family. In the morning, he talked to Ruth. They walked out to the edge of town together. The early April morning was cold but clear, the kind of sharp, sunny cold that promises spring without quite delivering it yet. And he laid out everything Agatha had said and everything he had been thinking, not guiding her toward any particular answer, but genuinely putting it before her and asking what she thought. Ruth listened with Jacob on her hip, looking out at the mountains to the north. The Wind River Range was visible from here on a clear day, white-capped and enormous and completely indifferent to anything below them. "I do not want to go back east," she said. "I thought, for a while, that was what I should want, that I should want to go back to my family and my community and be what I had been. But the truth is that the woman who started that journey last winter was a different woman than I am now. And those mountains," she looked at them, "they changed something. You changed something." She shifted Jacob to her other hip. "I want to build a life here, a real one, in the open, with room to grow. Is that something you want?" "It is everything I want," Eli said. "Then let us see this cabin," she said. They rode out to look at it that afternoon. The Hargrove cabin was in better shape than Agatha had suggested, and worse shape than Eli had hoped, which meant it was in exactly the kind of shape that a man with skills and determination could do something significant about. It was larger than his mountain cabin, with 2 proper rooms and the remains of what had been a substantial root cellar, and it sat in a clearing above Miller's Creek with the mountains filling the horizon to the north and east, and a south slope that was just exactly what a kitchen garden needed. Ruth stood in the clearing with the spring mud under her boots and turned in a slow circle, taking everything in, and Eli watched her face and read what was on it. "Yes," she said. Reverend Atkinson arrived on the first Friday of April as promised. A lean, sun-weathered man in a dusty black coat who moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had very much to do and very little time to do it in, covering enormous distances to minister to the scattered settlements and homesteads of Wyoming Territory. He performed 3 marriages, 2 baptisms, and a funeral in South Pass City over 2 days, and the marriage of Eli Calhoun and Ruth Byler was the second of the 3. It was held in the small open space behind Agatha's Hotel, which was the largest flat clear area available, and it was attended by Agatha and her daughter, the blacksmith, whose name was Horace Dunbar, and who had befriended Eli quickly during the fixing of the wagon wheel, Mrs. Turner with her new baby, who expressed his opinion of the ceremony loudly, and a handful of other townspeople who had, in 9 days, developed a warm regard for the serious, plain-spoken young woman from Ohio, and the massive, quiet mountain man from everywhere and nowhere. Ruth wore her dark dress with the white apron, freshly laundered, and her prayer cap, and she was more beautiful than Eli had words for. He had cleaned up as much as he ever did. A fresh shirt, the good coat, his hair tied back and his beard trimmed, and he was so aware of the contrast between them, the scale of him and the fineness of her, that it took an act of will to stand still and not simply stare. Jacob, held by Agatha, watched the proceedings with solemn concentration. Reverend Atkinson asked them the questions, and they answered them in turn, clearly and without hesitation. And when Eli put the ring, a simple silver band he had traded for at the general store, nothing grand but solid and real, on Ruth's finger, her eyes were bright and full of everything she did not need to say because it was all visible, plainly visible, on her face. He kissed her and felt, distantly and with some amusement, the sound of several people present making sounds of approval. "Congratulations, Mr. Calhoun," Reverend Atkinson said afterward, shaking his hand. "Thank you," Eli said. He looked at Ruth, who had Jacob back now and was holding him up so he could see the mountains, saying something quiet to him that Eli could not hear from where he stood. "Thank you," he said again, meaning something entirely different the second time. The summer of 1875 was a working summer. Eli and Ruth moved into the Hargrove cabin at the beginning of May and immediately set about making it into a home, which was a project that occupied every available hour for months and was the most satisfying, sustained undertaking Eli had ever engaged in, because he was doing it for something real. He replaced the roof first, because a solid roof was what everything else depended on, working from first light to the last hour of usable day, hauling timber from the ridge above the property, and splitting shingles with a speed and consistency that drew Horace Dunbar out from town one Saturday, just to watch and eventually to help. The 2 men worked well together, which surprised Eli somewhat, since he had never been much for partnership, but Horace was the kind of man who worked hard and did not fill the silence unnecessarily, and this they had in common. Ruth expanded the root cellar with a pickaxe while Eli was on the roof, which he discovered one afternoon when he came down for water and found the cellar entrance expanded by a considerable margin, and Ruth, covered in earth, sitting on the edge of it with a look of profound satisfaction. "You were supposed to be resting," he said. "I rested this morning," she said. "Jacob slept for 3 hours. That is not what rest means." "You're going to argue with an Amish woman about the value of work?" she said. "I would choose a different argument." He could not disagree with this assessment. He helped her finish the cellar. They put in the kitchen garden on the south slope, working the ground with the tools they had and improvising with what they did not have. Eli fashioned a planting stick from a hardwood branch that worked better than it had any right to, and Ruth organized the beds with a precision and efficiency that made him understand, watching it, that she had been doing this since she was old enough to hold a tool. She grew things in that first season that he had never grown and had not thought possible at that elevation, cabbage and turnips and beans and a remarkable quantity of squash, and the root cellar that they had finished in June was, by September, genuinely full. Jacob learned to sit up in July, to crawl in September, to pull himself to standing by the end of October, using whatever was available, including Eli's legs, which Jacob apparently found reliable and appropriately solid for the purpose. He was a grave, thoughtful, curious child with his mother's dark eyes and a profound interest in everything around him, and he regarded the world with an assessing attention that Eli recognized as entirely Ruth's and found completely charming in its small, round-faced manifestation. By November, when the first snows came down from the peaks and the nights turned long and deep and cold, the cabin was everything Eli had meant it to be, warm and solid and filled with the life of the people inside it. He lay awake sometimes in those early dark mornings and listened to Ruth breathing beside him and Jacob's small, steady sounds from his cradle in the corner, and felt the extraordinary, improbable fact of it all the way down to his bones. He had not expected this. He had made his peace, years ago, with the idea that this was not available to him, that he was the kind of man who lived alone, whose needs the mountains met entirely, for whom the company of other people was something encountered occasionally at trading posts and then left behind without grief. He had been wrong about that in a way that was, now that he was on the other side of it, deeply amusing. He had simply never had anything to compare it to. He had not known what he was missing because he had never had it. Ruth knew he felt this. She knew it without him saying it. That was one of her gifts, a deep and accurate intuition about the interior states of people she loved. And sometimes she would reach over in the dark and put her hand against his chest without saying anything, as though she were taking a measurement, and he would cover her hand with his own, and they would lie there in the quiet, listening to the wind in the pines. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him one such night. "The wolf," he said. She laughed softly. She knew this was shorthand by now. The wolf had become, between them, a kind of emblem for the idea that the most improbable things sometimes come to your door in the middle of a storm, and the only right response is to open it. "I think about her too sometimes," Ruth said. "I like to think she was happy after." "I have no doubt of it," Eli said. "She was practical. She took what the situation offered." "Like some people I know," Ruth said. He kissed the top of her head in the dark. The second winter brought a mild scare. Jacob developed a chest cough in February that lasted 2 weeks and had both of them awake more nights than not, taking turns with steam and the yarrow tea that Ruth made, and the camphor rub that Eli had learned from Washakie, and the combination of all three seemed to work, or the illness ran its natural course, or both, and Jacob emerged from it somewhat more substantial than before, as though the illness had been a kind of clarifying experience. He was 14 months old, and walking by then, with the deliberate, determined concentration of someone learning a new skill and refusing to accept failure. And the day he walked the full length of the cabin without holding on to anything, he stopped in the middle and looked at Eli with an expression of such pure satisfaction that Eli, sitting at the table with his coffee, broke into a grin wide enough to feel unfamiliar on his face. "Good man," he said. Jacob sat down with great deliberateness and then immediately got back up and did it again. In the spring of 1876, Ruth told him she was pregnant again. She told him the same way she told him everything, directly and without preamble, one morning when he was pulling on his boots and she was braiding her hair at the small mirror they had hung by the window. "I think we are going to have another child," she said, and watched him in the mirror. Eli stopped with one boot half on and looked up at her. His face did the thing it did when something moved him. It went very still, and something opened behind his eyes that was different from his ordinary steadiness, something that had warmth in it. "Good," he said. He pulled the boot on. He stood. He crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind and looked at both of them in the mirror, his size and darkness against her fineness, the long chestnut hair hanging loose at his shoulders and her dark hair half braided in her hands. And he said, "That is very good." "You're not worried?" she said. "About what?" "About everything. The last time, he said. "You were half frozen and alone in a blizzard, and there was no doctor within 3 days. This time you have a sound roof over your head, and I know where the doctor in South Pass City lives, and it is spring." He tightened his arms gently. "There is no comparison." Ruth leaned back against him and finished her braid in the mirror. "No," she agreed. There is not. The pregnancy was, mercifully, uncomplicated. Ruth continued to work at her usual pace, adapted slightly by practicality rather than inclination, and Eli finished the addition to the cabin that he had been planning since the previous autumn. A third room, proper and solid, for the child coming and whatever came after. He built a better chicken coop as well, because Ruth had made the very reasonable point that they needed eggs on a reliable basis, and the current arrangement was neither reliable nor, in her assessment, particularly dignified for the chickens. Horace Dunbar came out regularly now, bringing news from town and bringing his wife, Clara, on the days the road permitted it. And Clara and Ruth had developed a friendship that was good for both of them. A practical, comfortable, teasing friendship between two women who respected each other's competence and found each other's company genuinely enjoyable. Clara was from Missouri, direct and funny and unreserved in her opinions, and she and Ruth were different in almost every way except the ways that counted. "Does he always work like that?" Clara asked Ruth one afternoon, watching Eli on the roof of the new room while the two women sat on the porch and Ruth nursed Jacob. "Yes," Ruth said, "always. Since the first day I saw him, he does not know any other speed." "That is an extraordinarily useful quality in a husband," Clara said. "It is several useful things," Ruth agreed, and there was something in her tone that made Clara look at her sideways and then smile into her coffee cup. The second child was born in October of 1876, attended this time by the doctor from South Pass City, a capable, sensible man named Dr. Hendricks, who arrived 2 days before the birth and spent the intervening time examining the cabin's medical supplies with barely concealed amazement and eating Ruth's cooking with barely concealed joy. The birth went well, long but straightforward, Ruth's body having done this once before and remembering the knowledge, and at the end of it, Dr. Hendricks placed a healthy, loud, considerably annoyed-looking baby boy into Eli's arms. Eli held him and looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Hello, James." They had talked about the name. James for the middle name of his own father, who had died when Eli was 15 and whom he had loved more than anyone until recently, and Thomas is the given name, Thomas James Calhoun. But somehow, looking at him, James was what came out, and James was what the child became from that moment forward, despite the official record. Jacob, who was 22 months old and had been told extensively and carefully that a sibling was coming, inspected the new arrival with the same solemn, thorough attention he gave everything, and then looked up at Ruth. "He is very small," Jacob said. "You are very small, too," Ruth said. Jacob accepted this philosophically and went back to his inspection. Eli, watching his wife and his two sons in the firelight of the cabin he had built, felt something so enormous and complete inside him that it had no name, or rather, had many names, and all of them were too small for the specific thing he was feeling, so he did not try to name it. He just felt it. He let it be. The years that followed were built from work and weather and the rhythms of a life made by hand in a place that required everything from the people who lived there and gave everything back in return. The West was changing around them. The railroad had pushed through, bringing more settlers, more commerce, more conflict, more of everything. And South Pass City was in the process of transforming from a mining town into something more diversified, more permanent, more varied in its population and its needs. Eli found, to his own considerable surprise, that he had become something of a figure in the region. Not famous in any grand sense, but known in the way that capable and reliable and honest people become known in communities that depend on those qualities for their survival. He guided hunting parties in the autumn for men from the eastern cities who came west for adventure and left considerably wiser than they had arrived, and he trapped through the winter with the systematic efficiency he had always had. And he had begun to trade in lumber as well, running timber off his land and Horace's adjacent property to meet the demand from the town's expanding construction. Ruth had started a kitchen garden that was now large enough to supply not just themselves, but a small but consistent surplus that she traded at the general store. She kept records, careful, meticulous records in a small journal, of what grew well and what did not and what the ground needed, and she had begun, by the 3rd year, to advise other settlers on planting methods with a quiet authority grounded entirely in demonstrated results. People came to her with questions, and she answered them, and she did not charge for the advice, but accepted trade in kind without any false modesty about its value. She had also, by the 3rd year, begun to teach. Informally at first, Jacob needed schooling, and there was no school yet within a reasonable distance, so she taught him. And then 2 neighboring families discovered this and sent their children once a week. And then more came. And by the time Jacob was 5 years old, there were 8 children sitting in the extended room on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, while Ruth taught them reading and arithmetic and a substantial amount of natural history, because she believed firmly that a person should understand the world they lived in. Eli built them proper benches that year and a real teaching board, smooth pine, painted black, which worked as well as any slate, and said nothing about it because nothing needed to be said. She was doing what she did. He made the conditions for it possible. That was how it worked between them. Jacob was 6 when he first asked about his father, his first father, the one who had died in Ohio before Jacob was born. Ruth had always known this question was coming and had never been afraid of it, because she had never intended to hide anything. She sat Jacob down at the table and told him the truth, all of it appropriate to his age, that there had been a man named Jacob Byler who had loved his mother very much, and who had been taken from the world before he could meet the son he had helped to create, and that his name had been given to the first Jacob as a gift and an honor. "Is Eli my father?" Jacob asked with a child's directness. "He is your father in every way that matters," Ruth said. "He loves you, and he is here, and he will be here your whole life. The man who gave you his name loved you without ever meeting you, which is also real. You have both. You are not less than other children because of this. You are, if anything, more." Jacob thought about this. "Can I talk to Eli about the man named Jacob Byler?" "Of course," Ruth said. "Eli knew all about him. You can ask him anything." Jacob went to find Eli in the woodyard and had a conversation that lasted, by Eli's estimate, about an hour and covered the death of Jacob Byler, the nature of heaven, whether animals also go to heaven. Jacob was particularly concerned about this, and the question of whether it was possible to love 2 things at the same time, which Eli told him with complete honesty, was not only possible, but in fact one of the most important things a person could learn how to do. Jacob appeared satisfied with these answers and went back to his other activities. Eli went back to the woodpile and sat on it for a while, not chopping, just sitting, with his hands hanging between his knees and his face turned up to the October sky, very full of a feeling that was too complex to sort out, but was good, net, all things considered, very much good. James was 4 by then, a child so unlike his older brother in temperament that it was almost comical. Where Jacob was grave and quiet and systematic, James was loud and cheerful and operated on the principle that every situation was an opportunity for entertainment, including situations that were not objectively entertaining. He had Eli's build, already clearly heading toward his father's size, broad in the chest at 4 years old in a way that made people raise their eyebrows, and Ruth's face, and his own complete and original spirit that belonged to neither of them entirely, which Eli thought was how it should be. There was a moment in the autumn of 1879. Eli would think of it later as the moment he understood the full measure of what his life had become, when he came down from the ridge at dusk after a long day of working the timber with Horace and 2 hired hands, coming over the crest of the hill above the cabin, and looked down at the clearing below. The lamp was lit in the window. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking, Ruth's bread, he knew it by the smell, the grandmother's recipe, always the same, came up to him on the cool evening air. Jacob and James were playing in the yard below, their small voices reaching him in fragments on the wind, the particular shrieking energy of 2 boys at the end of a day. Ruth appeared in the doorway and called them in, and they ran to her, and she caught James when he ran too fast and stumbled, swinging him up with a laugh, and called something back over her shoulder into the cabin. Eli stood on the ridge in the last of the light and looked at all of this and felt something so complete and perfect that it was almost unbearable. Not in a painful way. In the way that extreme beauty is almost unbearable, the way the mountains were sometimes almost unbearable at first light, when the whole world was gold and pink and white and so perfectly itself that a man felt almost inadequate to be standing in the middle of it. He went down to the cabin. Ruth turned when she heard his step on the porch, and her face lit the way it did, the particular way it had always lit when he came back from somewhere, a brightness and a relief that she had never stopped showing, as though each return was still, in some part of her, remarkable. He never took it for granted. He was constitutionally incapable of taking it for granted because he understood, with the clarity of a man who had been there, exactly what the alternative looked like. "Supper in 20 minutes, she said. "Go wash. You smell like pine tar and honest labor." "Is that criticism?" he said. "It is a statement of fact," she said, "and perhaps mild appreciation for the honest labor part." She handed him a cup of coffee that she had poured the moment she heard his boots on the porch, because she always had, because she knew the sound of his specific step among all other steps as surely as she knew her own hands, and she always had the coffee ready. He took the cup and put his free hand on the side of her face, and she tipped her head into it, and they stood like that for a moment on the porch, with the last of the sunset spreading pink and gold across the mountains, and the boys making noise inside, and the smell of bread in the air. "Good day?" she asked. "Very good," he said. "Horace thinks we can double the output by spring if we get the second saw running." "I meant, personally," she said. "That too," he said. "Also very good." She smiled. "Good." She kissed him briefly and went back inside to her bread. By 1880, the school that Ruth had been informally running out of their cabin had grown beyond what the cabin could hold, and the community, loose and practical, as frontier communities generally were, organized itself to build a proper schoolhouse. It was Eli who suggested it at the town meeting that autumn in South Pass City, and Eli who drew the first lines of the plan on the back of a survey map, and Eli and Horace and 4 other men who cut the timber and raised the walls over 2 weeks in October, while Ruth, Clara, and several other women organized the feeding of the workers and the interior furnishings with a cheerful and totalizing efficiency that got the job done considerably faster than it might otherwise have. On the day the schoolhouse opened, Ruth stood at the door of it in the early morning and looked at what they had built: the real benches, the real teaching board, the windows that let in good clean light, the bell that Horace had located somewhere and installed on the roof, and Eli stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "I did not think." She stopped. She tried again. "When I was lying in the snow," she said, "I was thinking about all the things I had not done yet, all the things I had intended to do with my life that I had not gotten to yet. I did not know what they were, specifically. I just knew there was more." She turned to look at him. "I know what they were now." Eli looked at her for a long moment. The October morning was cool and clear, the aspens on the ridge behind them blazing gold, the kind of morning that belonged entirely to itself and to the people standing in it. "So do I," he said. She turned back to the schoolhouse door, and she opened it. The winters kept coming, as winters do, and each one was different, and each one was the same. The preparations, the storms, the long, still days inside when the world outside was white and the cabin was warm, the spring thaw and the first green shoots, and the starting again. Eli had stopped thinking of winter as something to endure, and thought of it instead as what it was: the season that showed you what you had built, whether the walls and the roof and the stores and the people inside them were sufficient to the test. They always were. He made sure of it. James grew to be exactly the child he had promised to be as an infant: loud, funny, deeply loving, and constitutionally incapable of sitting still for extended periods, which made school a challenge that Ruth navigated with a patience that Eli could only admire, since he was fairly certain the patience was not available to him in those quantities. Jacob was 7 and serious and reading everything he could find, borrowing books from Agatha's small lending library in town, from Dr. Hendricks, who turned out to have an extensive collection, from anyone who had them. He read Emerson on his own at 7, which made Eli very quietly proud in a way he was careful not to make too much of, because he believed pride should be experienced inwardly and expressed with restraint. In the spring of 1881, Ruth told him she was pregnant again. She told him in the same way she had told him both times before, simply and directly, one morning while he was pulling on his boots, and he responded in the same way he had responded both times. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her with complete attention, and then he crossed the room and held her for a moment without saying anything, because some things are beyond words, and pretending otherwise is just noise. 3, she said against his shoulder. 3, he agreed. She had been working on an idea she called a lending arrangement, a seed lending system, effectively, where settlers in the region could borrow seed stock from her supply with the understanding that they would return double the quantity after harvest. It was the kind of practical innovation that came from deep familiarity with a problem and a clear-eyed view of its solution. And it worked because Ruth understood, having come from a community built on mutual dependence, that the infrastructure of trust had to be built before the practical system could function, and she had been building that trust for 6 years. The pregnancy was a good one, and the baby came in November of 1881 with considerably less drama than its predecessors. A daughter this time, small and dark-haired and immediately, comprehensively furious about the conditions of her arrival, which she expressed at considerable volume and with impressive lung capacity. Ruth held her and laughed. "Well," she said. "Hello." "She has opinions," Eli said from his post beside the bed, Dr. Hendricks having retired briefly to the other room. "All the best people do," Ruth said. She looked up at him. "Miriam," she said, "after my mother." "Miriam," Eli said. He reached out one finger, and the baby, Miriam, immediately and with great authority grabbed it, which seemed to satisfy her considerably, because the screaming subsided into a series of smaller, investigative sounds. He looked at that tiny hand wrapped around his finger and felt the same impossible thing he had felt with Jacob and with James, that thing without a name that was made of love and astonishment and terror and gratitude, all collapsed into a single wordless weight. Jacob, 8 years old, came in to see his sister with the gravity of someone conducting an official inspection. He studied her for some time. Then he said, "She looks like you, Mama." "Does she?" Ruth said. "Ruth." "Yes," Jacob said with great certainty, "but I think she has Eli's temperament." This made both adults laugh, which Jacob accepted with dignified satisfaction. The years continued to build themselves, one on the next, the way good years do, without great drama but with great substance, each season adding to what had come before, the way rings of growth add to the trunk of a pine, until it is something you could not circle with both arms. The children grew. Jacob became, at 10, a boy who could track elk and read Latin and navigate by the stars, a combination that struck most people as unusual, but that made complete sense to anyone who knew him. James, at 8, discovered that he had a talent for music, specifically for the harmonica, which a peddler sold him for 2 chickens in the summer of 1883, a transaction Eli considered dubious until he heard the boy play, at which point he reversed his position entirely. Miriam was 3 and in charge of everything she surveyed, and the mountain lion she found sheltering under the porch one January morning she regarded not with fear but with intense professional interest, which was the moment Eli understood that his daughter was going to require a very particular kind of attention going forward. The lion left on its own. Eli had waited it out from a respectful distance, rifle ready, profoundly grateful that it had chosen to go voluntarily, and Miriam was disappointed that it had gone before she'd gotten a better look. "She wanted to be friends with it," James reported to Eli later, with the tone of someone who was not entirely sure whether this was impressive or alarming. "Yes," Eli said. "I know." He paused. "She's going to be a great deal of work." "She's already a great deal of work," James said with feeling. "Yes," Eli agreed, "but she's worth it." This was true of all of them. All of the work, all of it, was worth it, and he knew this with the clarity that comes from having once had nothing and now having everything that matters. The last winter he would think of as a hard one came in 1884, a blizzard out of the north that lasted 4 days and came down with a ferocity that reminded Eli, viscerally and completely, of the storm in which he had found Ruth. He was standing at the window on the second day of it, watching the snow pile against the glass, and Ruth came and stood beside him, And he looked at her and she looked back, and she said, "Yes, I'm thinking about it too." "You were very stubborn," he said, "about not dying." "I was," she agreed. "I decided, somewhere in the middle of it, that I was not willing, even when I could not feel my hands or my feet." She looked out at the storm. "I think I knew something was waiting." "What did you think it was?" "Not a mountain man," she said, "but something." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had leaned into him for 9 years, with the comfort of long familiarity that is the finest kind of love. Not the combustion of new things, but the deep, steady warmth of banked coals that will still be warm in the morning. "Do you miss Ohio?" he asked. He asked occasionally, not because he doubted the answer, but because he believed it was important to keep asking, to not take her presence as so completely given that the question stopped being worth asking. "Not Ohio specifically," she said. "Sometimes I miss my people, the community. There are parts of that life," she paused, "but when I try to go back in my imagination and stand in that life and look forward from it, I cannot see the things I see when I stand here." She looked at Jacob, who was at the table with his books, and at James, who was playing the harmonica in the corner in a way that was genuinely musical now, and at Miriam, who was 3 years old and sitting on the floor with a great seriousness, examining a pine cone with total absorption. "I cannot see any of this, and I would not give any of this away." He held her closer. She reached up and put her hand over his on her shoulder. "What would you have done," she said, "if I had died in the snow?" It was a strange question, and he turned it over. "I would have gone back to the cabin," he said, "and it would have been very quiet, and I would not have known what I had missed." He paused. "Which is a kind of mercy, but also a kind of poverty." "Yes," Ruth said. "Exactly." The storm broke on the 4th day, as storms always eventually do, and the world outside came back into being as it always does after storms, clean and white and impossibly bright, the snow on every surface catching the morning sun and throwing light in every direction at once so that the whole landscape seemed lit from within. Eli went out first, as he always did, to check the stock and assess the damage and begin the work of opening up the paths that the snow had closed. He stood in the yard and tilted his face up toward the winter sun, eyes closed, and breathed the cold air in deep. He heard the door behind him and turned, and Ruth was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee in each hand, the steam rising in the still, cold air, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and a woolen shawl pulled tight, her eyes bright in the winter light. "Come in when you are done admiring it," she said. "Breakfast is nearly ready." "5 more minutes," he said. She looked at the mountains and then at him. 5 minutes, she agreed. She went back inside. He could hear through the log walls the sounds of his family beginning the morning, Jacob's voice asking something, James responding with music rather than words, Miriam demanding something in the imperious tones she had been refining since birth, Ruth answering each of them in turn with that particular quality of attention she gave everyone she loved, steady and full and entirely real. The mountains behind the cabin stood in the morning light, white and enormous and entirely unchanged by anything that had happened in the small warm space at their feet. They had been there long before Eli Calhoun came to them as a young man running from something he could not name, and they would be there long after. But he had lived among them for 14 years, and he was, he thought, looking at them with the sun full in his face, about as close to understanding them as a person could get without becoming one of them. They had given him solitude when he needed it. They had given him the storm that brought Ruth to him. They had given him the landscape that his children would carry in their bones their whole lives, the particular quality of altitude and space and distance that shapes a person who grows up in it into someone wide-seeing and unhurried and capable of great stillness. He would not trade a day of any of it. He turned away from the mountains and went inside. The door closed behind him. The fire was going. He could feel the warmth even before he was fully through the door, and the smell of coffee and salt pork and Ruth's bread was filling the cabin in the way it always filled it, deeply and specifically, the smell that was home in a way that no other smell would ever be home, because home is made not from the place but from the people in the place, and the people here were his. 5 minutes was a long time, Ruth said, without turning from the stove. I was thinking, he said. About what? He sat down at the head of the table, and Jacob looked up from his book, and Miriam abandoned the pine cone she had apparently brought inside, and James played a brief flourishing figure on the harmonica as though providing a soundtrack, and Ruth turned with the pan and raised her eyebrows. About how good it is, Eli said. Ruth held his gaze for a moment. Then she set the pan down and filled his plate and said very quietly, Yes, it is. They ate breakfast around the table, all 5 of them, the morning sun coming through the windows in broad, flat angles that shifted slowly across the floor as the earth turned. Outside, the snow lay deep and clean and white on everything, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, patient and enormous and indifferent in all the best ways. Indifferent to the noise of history and the trouble of the world, indifferent to time, but present in the way that the truest things are always present, constant, available, and completely real. And inside the cabin that Eli Calhoun had built with his own hands on the land above Miller's Creek, in the Wind River country of Wyoming Territory, in the year of 1884, there was warmth and food and the sound of children and the smell of bread and a woman with dark eyes who had been left for dead in a snowstorm a decade ago, and who had become the center of a life that neither she nor the man who found her could have predicted or imagined, but which had turned out to be, in every particular that mattered, exactly right.